And welcome to this special segment of TI Now. We're talking today with Tim Harden. He's the president of supply chain and fleet operations for AT&T. And Tim, welcome to the program.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Thanks for being back. The last time we spoke was down in your neck of the woods in Dallas.
It's been a while.
It's good to have you back up here in Arlington, Virginia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, today we're talking about this transition per se from the supply chain, that linear, traditional supply chain, to a value chain. Why is it important to have a value chain in our ecosystem today?
You have to make sure that, in fact, you can get to market as fast as possible. And a value chain gives you the best option to be able to stay ahead of not only where your competitors are going, but be able to continue to increase the time frames or reduce the time frames, but increase the value and speed at which you can move through the supply chain. Very, very important in today's world, more so as you start to move into more software-defined products.
Tim, is the secret behind the value chain that interdependence between, let's say, the manufacturer in your case, and maybe the consumer, the people that you have to worry about later or further down the value chain?
Without question. You need to be able to get to that end user as quickly as possible with products that they want to buy. And there's a very short window of time that you need to be able to land in. That requires that you swim all the way up the value chain to make sure that you understand kind of where all the pressure points are and can work with the suppliers to try to eliminate or reduce the amount of time it takes to get through each of those gates. So as you look at where the supply chains move in the next certainly 5 years, they'll be moving more and more towards this type of a model where they can be very interdependent and interlocked with their key suppliers to be able to deliver products in the time frames the consumer wants to buy.
Tim, of course, managing the supply chain is your business. That's what you do every day. What's wrong with today's linear, I guess, traditional quote-unquote supply chain?
Well, it served us well. And it was predominantly a model where you were driving as much cost out as possible for a particular point in time. I think the reason that we have moved towards these value chains and the reasons that we're rapidly moving towards even more collaborative environments is because of the time factor. Cost is still very important, but you can extract cost out of those processes that you were uncovered as you went kind of through these analysis to say you're costing yourself money in the way in which you're managing between yourselves as opposed to the raw materials that go into the product. Raw materials are still very important. If you look at the bill of materials, still very important to understand each of those items and have the dialogue with the suppliers, and that will continue regardless of where the supply chains move. But I think what's really coming into sharp focus is the ability to look all the way through end to end and see all the way through those processes where you're costing each other money, and by being able to extract it, you actually create a much better product in a much shorter time frame and at a cost point that is advantageous to both parties.
Tim, it seems like there's two layers, if you will, to the value chain. One is that linear supply chain where that product moves along the conveyor belt, again, if you will. And then the other layer is the communications value chain, whereby there's got to be collaboration in order for that product to get to the end user. Would you agree with that assessment?
Definitely. If you look at the linear piece, still have to pay attention to quality, still have to pay attention to what goes into making up that product and how that end product gets produced. That will always be there. But these other elements have, as I said, come into much sharper focus as being important to the true cost of actually implementing a new product or the true cost of buying a particular product from a supplier. And as you go more and more into this, what's happening is you're able to separate out those things which are true commodities, which you can buy in the traditional linear fashion, versus those things that really have tremendous value add that need to be in a more collaborative environment.
Tim, of course, there's benefits for AT&T, for the end user carrier, when you increase that collaboration, those relationships in the value chain. But what about the other folks in the value chain? What about the suppliers and manufacturers and chip makers? Are they receiving the same value?
Yeah, I think, well, the answer from our perspective is yes. You might have to ask them whether they feel the same way. But one thing that we've seen as we've gone through this is if you sit down and you have a bill of materials in front of you, and you truly understand what the total cost is associated with that product, and have the dialogue with that supplier, and you really understand kind of what's driving each line item on those bill of materials, then you get into a dialogue where you actually get to have the ability to extract cost out of what that product may ultimately cost you at the end of the process. And the reasons for that is many times what we're finding is that requirements get carried over from year to year or from product to product. Not always the same requirements are needed 2 years down the road versus what they were 2 years previously. But the cost of having that particular requirement in the bill of materials is something that could be extracted, and it ends up being a win-win for both parties. I get a lower cost because I really don't want to pay for that anymore, I don't need it anymore, and the supplier is able to extract it and provide the product at a much lower cost without necessarily losing the margin that they need in order to survive. Very important point in this whole process is this is not about the buyer always winning. This has to be an ecosystem that goes on for a long time, and so the supplier has to be able to make a profit, has to be able to be here for a very long time in order for this entire ecosystem to work.
I want to talk briefly about the production cycle. I remember in a previous interview that we had, you talked about that 18-month production cycle, and if there's a glitch in that chain at some point, it might take you another 18 months to get back to the same point in that chain. Right. How do you cut that cycle down?
So we've spent a lot of time looking at this particular point, and it is about truly understanding each step in the process of what's adding time into the in-state delivery. And when you understand that, then you can start to attack those various handoff points, and through collaboration with the vendor, begin to extract time out of those processes. That's how you start to shorten it up. So what we've seen is we went from an average of about 23 months developing a product, and for those suppliers that we got very collaborative with in this value-added model, we were able to reduce the time frame to 12 months. So if you think about that, both sides win because they both get to revenue much faster than they were in the previous process, and it was costing less to get through that entire process, so there wasn't as much impact on margin on both sides because you were getting there much quicker. Got a better product or got the same product, just got there much quicker because you went back and looked at end to end, how that process was working and started attacking those things that made no sense to continue in the old models.
Tim, we're all moving towards, and when I say we all as an industry, moving towards open networks, open platforms, open sourcing. Domain 2.0 was launched not long ago, I believe, in the latter part of 2013. Right. What is that going to do for the industry? And can you tell me a little bit about it?
We looked at the industry and said, we need to attack this differently in order for us to ensure that the suppliers are healthy enough to get us to the next generation of network requirements. And that became what we've called Domain 1.0. We went at, cut the network buys into 8 domains, in essence created large hunting grounds where there was no such thing as an RFP. If you had a great idea and it drove value into the equation and it had scale and scope, it fit from that perspective, we just implemented it. And we did that going after a specific set of suppliers that we ultimately selected into those domains. That's what enabled us to get to this 12-month cycle time. We got very collaborative. We went to something called One Lab, where each side was trying to add value in the process of getting a new product through. A couple of examples in there that we extracted, in one case, almost 2 years worth of time out of the timeline by just going to collaborative process to get something out the door. It was a tremendous effort, and we keep refining this as we go forward. As we looked forward, and these were 5-year contracts, and we're basically getting to the end of the 5th year, we look forward to say, what's the challenges that we have ahead? Back then it was stability in the supply chain. What's ahead of us is being able to stay ahead of the capacity demands that are out there. And if you think about where the networks are today, and you think about where tablets are today, you think of the power of smartphones, you really have an environment which will really create this huge volume of traffic going forward. More and more folks are utilizing the capabilities, the data capabilities, driving more and more bandwidth onto the networks. And that tidal wave of information, tidal wave of traffic, means that you have to go at this model differently. You can't continue to build this the same way that you were 5 years ago. One, it's too expensive to continue to build it that way. Secondly, just trying to stay ahead with all that hardware in the traditional model is difficult to do. Just maintenance windows alone, trying to get the network stood up. So we had to take a step back to say, how do we want to go at this over the next 5 years? And it really brought forward the need for us to move to more software-defined networks with network function, virtualization, in essence pulling software out of the hardware, moving it into a cloud-based environment, and enabling us to go much quicker. Certainly easier to bring things forward in a software-based environment, easier to put new things in a software-based environment, much cheaper to put things in a software-based environment. All those things are key factors that are driving us to what we're calling Domain 2.0. And 2.0 is 9 domains. 6 of the 9 are software-oriented. And it's really positioning us to be able to stay ahead of the next wave of traffic demand on the network, about 70% of which we think will be video.
Tim, thanks for your time.